There is a crater where a mountain used to be. Not a small dent, not a scar in the earth. A crater so wide that 3 cities could have sat inside it, and so deep that the rock at the bottom has been compressed into something that geologists will argue about for centuries because it does not match any known mineral on this planet. 2 men made that crater. One of them is still standing. And to understand how we got here, you have to go back to the moment when the impossible decided it was not done surprising everyone. If you have ever asked yourself which fighter is truly beyond measurement, beyond the concept of limits itself, then this is the video that was made for you. Today, we are going all the way. Full power Goku against the man who ended his own story by becoming too strong for stories to contain. Subscribe right now and hit that bell because what happens in this video is the kind of thing people will still be talking about years from now. Do not let the algorithm bury this one. It did not start with a battle cry or a dramatic declaration or even a moment that anyone could point to and say that is when everything changed. It started with weather. Not the kind of weather that forecasters predict or that farmers read in cloud formations, but the kind of weather that the atmosphere produces when something that should not exist has entered the space it occupies, and the sky itself does not quite know what to do with the information. The clouds above a remote stretch of the Mojave Desert began rotating without wind, pulling together into a spiral that meteorologists on the eastern seaboard were already calling unprecedented before anyone had a single explanation for it. Goku landed first. He always lands first when there's something worth arriving for, and whatever he had sensed from 3 solar systems away was worth more than arriving for. It was worth racing toward at a speed that left a visible distortion trail across the upper atmosphere, a long, pale scar of compressed air that hung in the sky for 11 minutes after he was already on the ground. He stood there in the quiet of the desert, with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes scanning the horizon the way a musician listens for a note that has not been played yet but is already on its way. He could feel it. Not with key sense exactly. Key sense had always been like listening to a conversation and identifying the voices. This was different. This was like feeling the temperature of the room change before someone opened a door that had not existed until right now.
Saitama arrived the way Saitama always arrives, without announcement, without drama, and wearing an expression that somehow managed to convey complete awareness of the situation while also communicating a kind of bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with fatigue. He had followed something, too. Not a power signature. Saitama could not sense those the way trained fighters could, but a feeling. The specific gravitational pull that his body seemed to produce toward anything that might, against all evidence and prior experience, actually matter. He had learned not to trust that feeling. It had let him down every single time. But he kept following it, because the alternative was going home and staring at a wall, and the wall had nothing new to say. They looked at each other across 200 meters of cracked desert ground. The air between them was doing something unusual, not vibrating exactly, but settling, the way air settles in a room when 2 sounds at very different frequencies are played simultaneously, and the space between them becomes a third thing entirely. Goku's hair was white, not the gold of Super Saiyan, not the blue of the God form, white, shot through with faint traces of silver at the edges, because what he had arrived in was not a transformation he reached for. It was a state he had stopped resisting. Ultra Instinct Mastered is the wrong name for it, if you want to be precise about it, because mastery implies a ceiling you have touched and now own. What Goku carried in that moment was something that had outgrown the concept of mastery, the same way the ocean outgrows the word deep. Saitama tilted his head slightly to the left. That was the tell, the one small motion that anyone who had watched him long enough would recognize as the closest thing he had to genuine interest, to the door in his chest cracking open just far enough to let something in. His hands were at his sides, and his fingers were relaxed, not curled, not ready. He looked from a distance like a man waiting for a bus. Up close, if you were standing at that 200-meter mark and you could feel what his stillness was doing to the atmosphere around him, the way it was pressing outward very gently, the way a held breath presses against a closed mouth, you would understand that what looked like rest was actually the surface of something with no floor. Goku smiled, wide, open, completely real. The kind of smile that had no strategy behind it and no performance in it, just the pure, unguarded expression of a person encountering something that delights them down to the level of reflex. He had not felt this since the Tournament of Power. He had not felt exactly this, ever. And somewhere in the part of him that existed before training and transformation and the long road of becoming, a very simple and very ancient thing lit up and said, yes.
Goku moved first, and the ground where he had been standing did not just crack, it inverted, the packed desert earth punching downward in a perfect circle 3 meters deep, as though the planet itself had flinched away from the force of his departure. He crossed 200 meters in a time frame that has no comfortable word in any human language, something between an instant and the idea of an instant, and his fist arrived at the place where Saitama's jaw was with a force that, if you ran the numbers honestly, exceeded anything that had ever been recorded in that atmosphere. The shock wave alone flattened every rock formation within a half-mile radius, a rolling wall of compressed air that moved outward like a slow-motion detonation, carrying dust and gravel and the particular silence that follows something that has never happened before. Saitama's head moved, not much, a few degrees to the right, the way a person tilts their head when they hear a sound from another room that is interesting but not urgent. His feet did not move. The ground under them cracked in a spiderweb pattern that spread outward 20 meters in every direction, which told you something about the force involved, something about what his legs had quietly absorbed so that the rest of him did not have to register it. He looked at Goku's fist, which was still in contact with the side of his face, and then he looked at Goku, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just been handed a gift he was not expecting and is still deciding how he feels about it. Goku pulled back and hit him again, then he was no longer hitting in any sequence a human eye could follow, both hands moving in overlapping arcs that generated their own wind, their own sound, a rhythmic concussive percussion that turned the air between them into something textured and pressurized and almost visible. Each strike carried the full weight of ultra instinct, not as a technique, but as a condition, his body responding to Saitama's micro-movements before his mind had processed them, adjusting angles and force vectors in real time, with a precision that made every blow land exactly where it was most effective. This was Goku at a level where thinking had become unnecessary, where the body had learned to be smarter than the mind that owned it. And Saitama stood there and took it. Not because he could not move, he could, and occasionally he did, shifting his weight or lifting a forearm, and when he lifted a forearm, it redirected Goku's strikes with a casualness that should not have been physically possible, a simple geometric change of angle that sent force sideways into the air rather than into his body. What was remarkable was not that he was blocking. What was remarkable was that he was choosing when to bother. There was a quality to his defense that felt less like fighting and more like editing, deciding which parts of an experience were worth engaging with and which could simply be allowed to pass. Goku landed 30 meters back and stood there breathing, not from exhaustion, but from the deep involuntary rhythm of someone whose body is running at full capacity, every system open, every resource deployed. His aura was extraordinary, a white-silver light that did not flicker but breathed, expanding and contracting with his heartbeat, illuminating the dust around him in slow pulses that made the desert look like it was underwater. He felt it then, the thing his body had been trying to tell his conscious mind since the moment he landed, that Saitama's ceiling was not above him. It was that Saitama did not have one. Not a hidden one, not a deeper one that unlocked under pressure. The absence itself was the thing.
And Goku's body, which had spent a lifetime reading the architecture of opponents and calculating trajectories toward victory, had arrived at a wall it could not map because the wall had no other side. He powered up further. The white deepened into something that does not have a color name, and the desert within a quarter-mile radius lifted, not explosively but gently, every loose grain of sand rising slowly as though gravity had politely excused itself. This was the version of Goku that had pushed beyond every teacher, every rival, every god who had told him the next level was unreachable. This felt to him like the truest thing he had ever been. Saitama watched all of this, and then he did something that Goku had never seen an opponent do in the middle of a fight at this level. He sighed. Not from boredom, or not entirely from boredom, but from something older and quieter, the specific exhale of a person who has been carrying a particular hope for a very long time and can feel already the familiar shape of its departure. He raised his fist anyway.
The punch Saitama threw did not look like much from the outside, and that has always been the cruelest joke written into his existence, that the most catastrophic thing a living body has ever produced looks, in the moment of its release, like a man swatting at something he is not even particularly annoyed by. His arm extended, his fist connected with the leading edge of Goku's aura before it even reached his body, and what happened next was not an explosion in any traditional sense of the word. It was a cancellation, a negation so complete and so immediate that the white-silver light that had been lifting the desert floor simply ceased, not blown away, not dispersed, but ended, the way a sentence ends, the way a sound ends when the thing producing it no longer exists. Goku went back, not stumbling, not ragdolling, back in a straight line at a velocity that took him through a rock formation the size of an apartment building as though the rock formation were a strong opinion and he were evidence to the contrary. He hit the ground 400 meters away and carved a trench through it that curved upward at the end, and he came to rest at the bottom of that curve with his back against the earth and the sky above him doing something strange. The clouds had stopped rotating and were now simply sitting there, stunned, which is not a thing clouds do, and yet. He lay there for 2 full seconds, which was the longest Goku had been horizontal in a fight since he was a child learning what gravity meant. In his chest was a feeling he recognized distantly, the way you recognize a word in a language you studied once a long time ago. It was the feeling of being surpassed. Not challenged, not matched, surpassed, in the clean, unambiguous way that a fact surpasses an argument. His body had felt the punch and responded to it the way Ultra Instinct was designed to respond to anything, by reading it, processing it, preparing a counter. And then the processing had simply returned nothing, because there was nothing to process, because the force behind that punch did not operate on a scale that analysis could reach. It was like trying to measure the ocean with a ruler that only went up to 12 inches. The ruler was not wrong, it was just not the right tool for the job, and there was no right tool, and that was the point.
He got up, because Goku always gets up, because getting up is the one thing that has remained constant across every transformation and every defeat, and every moment where the universe showed him something he had not been prepared for. He got up, and he looked across the crater field at Saitama, who had walked, not moved at combat speed, but actually walked, to a spot about 50 meters closer, and was standing there with his arms at his sides and that expression on his face, the one that looked like neutrality, but was actually something much more complicated, something that lived in the neighborhood of grief without quite being grief, the way a scar lives in the neighborhood of a wound. This is the part that nobody talks about when they discuss what happened in that desert, because the part that came next was so large that it swallowed everything around it. But in those few seconds, between Goku rising from the trench and what came after, something passed between them that had nothing to do with power levels or combat capability. Goku saw it in Saitama's posture, The slight drop in the shoulders, the way his hands were not fists but not quite open either, hanging there in the middle of a gesture that had no resolution. And he understood, with the specific clarity that only comes when your body has just been educated past the point of argument, that what he was looking at was not an opponent in the way he had always understood the word. He was looking at someone who had won so completely that winning had become the problem. Someone for whom this fight, this extraordinary, impossible, universe-straining fight, was already on some level over. Not because Saitama had beaten him, but because Saitama already knew how it ended, and he had known since before the first punch, and he had thrown it anyway because the alternative was admitting that there was no alternative. Goku powered up to the absolute edge of everything he had, and the universe, for the first time in its long history of witnessing remarkable things, held completely still.
What happened next did not register on any instrument built by human hands, and that is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a precise and literal statement about the event that followed. The seismographs in 3 countries flatlined simultaneously, not because there was no activity, but because the activity exceeded the range their sensors were designed to measure. The needle going so far past the maximum that it wrapped back around to 0 and stayed there, confused, reporting silence into the middle of the loudest thing that had ever occurred in that hemisphere. The orbital satellites that happened to be passing overhead captured footage that scientists would spend the next decade arguing about, a bloom of light that appeared to have depth to it, not spreading outward like an explosion, but opening inward like a door, like something that had been sealed for a very long time had been given permission to stop pretending. Goku hit Saitama with everything. And everything, when it belongs to Goku at his absolute ceiling, is a number so large it stops being a number and becomes a concept, the accumulated weight of every battle, every near death, every transformation that rewrote the rules of what a body could survive. It is the Kamehameha refined across a lifetime into something so pure it has stopped being a technique and become an extension of will. The way a master calligrapher's brushstroke stops being a motion and becomes a thought made physical. The beam that left his hands was white at the center and colorless at the edges, eating light rather than producing it, carving a tunnel through the atmosphere that the air rushed back into with a crack that broke windows in a city 40 miles away. Saitama walked through it. Not around it, not above it, through it, into the direct center of it, and the beam parted around him the way a river parts around a stone that has always been there, the water adjusting its path, not because the stone asked it to, but because the stone's presence is simply a fact that the water must accommodate. His jumpsuit was unmarked. His expression had shifted slightly, not to something harder or more focused, but to something quieter, a specific internal stillness that people sometimes reach at the end of a long search when the result is not what they hoped for, and they are in the process of accepting that with whatever dignity they have left.
He reached Goku through the beam and hit him with a punch pulled to perhaps 1/10 of his actual capacity, and Goku traveled backward through space for a distance that would have taken him out of the atmosphere entirely if he had not caught himself, hands thrust outward, ki blazing from every surface of his body as he arrested his own momentum through sheer concentrated will. He hung there in the upper atmosphere, with the curvature of the earth visible behind him and the desert below looking small and pale and quiet, and he laughed. Not the laugh of someone who finds something funny, but the laugh of someone who has just received information that restructures everything they thought they understood, the involuntary exhale of a mind that has been genuinely, completely surprised. He came back down slowly, and when he landed in front of Saitama, the aura around him had changed, still present, still immense, but different in quality, less like a declaration and more like a conversation. His hands were opened at his sides. This detail matters more than it might seem. Goku's hands open in a fight means something specific, means the part of him that calculates and competes has stepped back to let the part of him that simply experiences come forward. He looked at Saitama the way he had looked at very few things in his life, with the clean, undefended recognition of something that exists entirely outside his frame of reference and is remarkable precisely because of that. Saitama looked back at him, and for just a moment, brief enough that you could miss it if you were watching the sky or watching the ground or watching anything other than his face in that exact second, his expression broke open into something unguarded and raw and almost desperate, the face of someone who had spent years alone in a room, hoping for a knock at the door, and had finally, after all this time, heard one. His eyes were wide. His hands, which had been loose and uncurled this entire fight, curled slightly at the fingers, not into fists, but into the shape a hand makes when it is about to reach for something it is afraid to want. And then it closed again. The neutrality returned like a curtain dropping, professional and practiced and almost convincing. Almost.
They sat down in the crater together, which is not how anyone who had been watching from a distance would have predicted this ending, and yet it was the only ending that made sense if you had been paying attention to the right things, not the power outputs or the force calculations or the question of who was technically still standing. The right things, the small ones, the ones that a camera would never think to point itself at. The way Goku dropped to the ground with the easy looseness of someone whose body had given everything it had and was now simply grateful to be done. The way Saitama lowered himself next to him with the careful deliberateness of a person who has learned to be gentle with situations that might break if handled wrong. The dust settled around them in slow curtains, and the desert went back to being a desert, indifferent and golden and unchanged, as though two forces that between them could have rearranged the geography of a small continent had simply borrowed this space for a while and were now returning it. Goku spoke first. He said it was the best fight he had ever had, and he said it the way he said everything true, without architecture, without any attempt to make it land correctly, just the plain fact of it released into the air between them. And he meant the best in the full weight of that word, not the most competitive or the most technically demanding, but the best in the sense that it had reached into him and found something he had not known was still there waiting to be found, a version of joy so uncomplicated and so complete that it preceded language, preceded training, preceded every layer of warrior and hero and legend that had been built on top of the original thing. Saitama was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the sun moved a visible distance across the sky, long enough that a hawk appeared overhead and made 3 wide circles and departed, long enough that the silence between them stopped being awkward and became something else, the kind of silence that is actually a form of communication between people who have stopped needing words to be understood. And then he said something that Goku would think about for years afterward, not because it was profound in any way that would look impressive written down, but because of how it was said, quietly, almost to himself, the way a person says something they have been holding for so long that saying it out loud feels less like sharing and more like setting down a weight. He said that he had not felt that in a very long time. He did not specify what that was. He did not need to.
This is what the fight was actually about, underneath the force measurements and the atmospheric disturbances and the crater that would eventually become a landmark and then a tourist destination and then a mythology. It was about 2 people who had, each in their own way, outgrown the world that was built to contain them, and who had spent a long time on the other side of that threshold with no one who could follow them there. Goku had his family, his rivals, his endless forward momentum through levels and forms, and the perpetual horizon of the next challenge. And still, in the place that momentum could not reach, there was something quiet and unaddressed that only showed itself in moments like this one. Saitama had his apartment and his grocery lists, and the particular loneliness of a person who has become so large that the ordinary world has become a place he visits rather than a place he lives. And still, against all the accumulated evidence of his experience, he had kept showing up to fights with that small, cracked-open hope that this time would be different. This time was different, not because of who won, and that question, the one everyone arrived here with, the one printed in the title and carried through every part of this story, turns out to be the least important thing that happened in that desert. The crater exists. Both of them made it. Neither of them walked away diminished. What walked away from that desert was something that had not existed before they arrived, the specific and irreplaceable knowledge, carried now in two separate chests, that somewhere in this universe there is one other person who understands exactly what it is like to be you, completely, without translation, without the long, exhausting work of explanation. For Goku, that knowledge felt like a door opening. For Saitama, it felt like a door that had been stuck for years, finally, quietly, giving way. They sat there until the stars came out, and the desert held them both without asking anything in return, the way deserts do, the way silence does, the way the best and rarest things always do, simply by being large enough to contain whatever is brought to them and asking nothing about its name.